You know, every war has a moment when people on both sides can feel something changing in the air. A moment when the noise sounds different, the sky looks different, and the soldiers, who have lived too long with the smell of smoke, sense a shift they can't quite explain. And in the winter of 1945, across the frozen ruins of Europe, that shift came like a cold breath from the east. The Third Reich, which once bragged that it would last 1,000 years, was cracking apart like old plaster. 100 days, that's all it had left. 100 days between a collapsing empire and the silence that comes after. And if you were standing there in the mud, in the snow, in the rubble, you could feel it, you could hear it, you could almost taste the desperation. Some soldiers said you could see the end in the eyes of German officers who still shouted orders but no longer believed their own voices. Others saw it in the way civilians moved, quick, nervous, clutching what little they had left. You could see it in the sky too, where the once fearsome Luftwaffe now sent up thin, patchy formations that scattered the moment American Mustangs or British Spitfires appeared. The Reich wasn't just losing ground, it was losing breath, losing will, losing the last threads of a dream built on lies and violence. And in these final 100 days, Europe wouldn't simply watch Germany fall. Europe would live through the greatest collapse of a modern nation the world had ever seen. Before we dive deep into those last 100 days of the war, the madness, the chaos, the humanity, let me pause for just 1 second. If you enjoy these long, warm, old storyteller journeys through history, make sure you subscribe to the channel. It keeps this kind of storytelling alive, helps us reach more history lovers, and it genuinely means a lot. And if you know someone who's also fascinated by World War II, share this video with them too. Now pull up a chair. Let's walk into 1945 together. The story really begins in January, when the ground across Europe was iron-hard with winter frost and Germany's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, was collapsing in the forests of Belgium. Hitler had poured everything he had left into that counterattack. Fuel he couldn't replace, tanks he couldn't repair, men he couldn't afford to lose. And what did he get? A bulge in the lines that lasted a few weeks before the Allies punched it flat. Some German officers later wrote that this was the moment they knew the war was lost. They'd hoped the offensive would break the Allies' spirit the way France had broken in 1940. But instead, the American lines bent, held, then snapped back with such force that entire German divisions simply disappeared under artillery and airstrikes. There's a haunting line in one of the American after-action reports from the Bulge. A captain wrote, "We stopped thinking about winning, we started thinking about finishing." That's what the Allies carried with them as they crossed the Rhine and rolled toward the heart of Germany. A determination not fueled by glory but by exhaustion. These were men who wanted to go home, who'd seen enough shattered villages and frozen foxholes to last a lifetime. And yet they pushed forward mile by mile, because they knew every step brought the war closer to its end. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, where suffering seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon, the Red Army began its final, crushing march toward Berlin. You've probably heard the stories: cities reduced to rubble, forests filled with the wreckage of tanks, entire landscapes carved by artillery. But the human part of it is harder to grasp. Imagine millions of soldiers, many of them barely adults, marching through the ruins of Poland, fighting past the remnants of the German army that once tore across the continent with terrifying speed. Now the tables had turned. Now the Germans were the ones digging trenches, blowing bridges, trying to slow the avalanche. And the avalanche did not slow. Soviet accounts from that winter are full of strange details. One officer remembered walking into a village where every building had burned down except a single brick chimney, nothing else. Just a chimney standing alone in the snow like a gravestone for the whole town. Another wrote about the eerie quiet after a bombardment, when the snow fell in soft flakes over the smoking craters, almost tenderly, as if nature was trying to hide what human beings had done. Inside Germany, people were beginning to understand what that meant. The propaganda machine was still grinding out speeches about miracle weapons and heroic stands, but the people could see the truth from their windows. Every night the sky glowed red from cities burning. Every morning brought new columns of refugees trudging through ice and mud. You'd see women pulling sleds loaded with blankets and kettles, old men leaning on sticks, children wrapped in thin coats, wide-eyed and silent. They weren't fleeing the Allies. At that point, they were fleeing the collapse of their own world. In Berlin, Hitler's bunker became the beating heart of a dying regime. But don't imagine it as a place of confident military planning. No, officers who entered that bunker described it like stepping into a fever dream, maps on the walls that no longer matched reality, Hitler pacing, ranting about divisions that didn't exist, secretaries too exhausted to think straight, the smell of stale air and cold concrete everywhere. Some of the last reports we have from that bunker describe Hitler's hands shaking uncontrollably, his voice cracking, his eyes drifting as if looking through fog. The man who once terrified half the world was becoming a ghost before the war even ended. Meanwhile, the Western Allies crossed into the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr. This was the region that had powered German armies for years: steel, coal, factories, rail lines. But by 1945, most of it was broken. British and American bombers had been pounding it since 1943. Bridges lay in rivers, train cars were twisted like paper. Workers moved through the ruins like sleepwalkers. And yet, even in this devastation, the Allied soldiers wrote about how surreal it felt to see ordinary life carrying on. A bakery still operating out of a half-destroyed building. A woman hanging laundry next to a crater. Children playing with a homemade soccer ball on a street filled with rubble. It reminded them that behind every uniform, behind every firefight, there were people just trying to survive another day. One American infantryman, just 19, wrote in his diary about entering a German farmhouse that had been abandoned only hours earlier. The fire was still burning in the stove. A pot of soup sat on the table, still warm, and on a small shelf was a row of tiny carved wooden animals, each painted with care. "It hit me then," he wrote. "The enemy was also somebody's family, somebody's childhood. Moments like that can shake a man's soul." Another piece of the story often gets overlooked: the air war in these final months. By early 1945, the skies over Germany belonged almost entirely to the Allies. American P-51 Mustangs patrolled the air like hawks. Thunderbolts roared across roads and rail lines, cutting off what little supply the Germans had left. And the bombers, well, they came in waves. By this point, German radar operators were so overwhelmed that some simply stopped calling out every formation. What was the point? Fuel was nearly gone, pilots were scarce. The most experienced German aces were either dead or grounded forever. There's a Luftwaffe report from March 1945 where an officer wrote that some new pilots were taking their first flight on the same day they fought their first battle and their last. 4 hours of training, maybe 5. No wonder the skies became one-sided so quickly. Imagine being a German civilian hearing that long rumble of engines overhead, knowing there was no shelter deep enough, no wall strong enough to turn the tide. People slept in basements for weeks. Some kept a small bag packed at all times, a few photographs, a blanket, whatever they could grab. There were cities like Dresden, where the firestorm was so intense that the oxygen was pulled straight out of the streets. Survivors crawled over melted streets with the heat still rising through their shoes. One of them later wrote, "I didn't think the world could burn like that." Meanwhile, on the ground, Allied forces were discovering the darkest corners of the Reich. Camps, Warehouses filled with personal belongings, train cars left abandoned with horrors inside. Even the most battle-hardened men who'd stormed beaches, fought through forests, survived tank battles, broke down when they saw what had been happening behind the front lines. Some reports were so horrific that commanders initially hesitated to send them back home because they feared no one would believe them. But they had to be sent. The world needed to know. And those discoveries fueled the Allies with a new fire. This wasn't just a war to win, it had become a moral obligation to finish it. By March, the Rhine, the great river that had once protected Germany, was no longer a barrier. American engineers built bridges in record time, some of them under direct fire. The Germans blew as many bridges as they could, but the Allies just kept building new ones. One officer joked that the Americans were building bridges faster than the Germans could destroy them. For once, a bit of humor wasn't exaggeration. And while the Western Allies marched deeper, the Red Army closed in from the east, tightening the noose around Berlin. Stalin's generals had been waiting a long time for this moment. They wanted to take the Nazi capital themselves to avenge the millions of Soviet citizens lost since 1941. They wanted the Reichstag, the heart of it all. By April, Berlin was surrounded. Artillery thundered day and night. Fires burned without stopping. Civilians hid in cellars, listening to the shriek of shells. The city that once dreamed of ruling Europe now trembled with every explosion. And deep beneath the streets in that bunker, Hitler clung to fantasies of counterattacks that would never come. His generals tried to tell him the truth. Some were shouted down, some were dismissed, some simply stopped trying. All right, let's pause right here for a moment. If you're still with me and you want to keep walking through these last 100 days together, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button too. It helps more than you'd ever guess. And if you know someone who loves these deep, human stories of the war, share this with them. And so, as the winter of 1945 began to thaw into a cold, gray spring, the world could feel something shifting in the air, even if no one quite trusted the feeling yet. People had learned to be careful with hope. It had been betrayed too many times, but still it was there, like a tiny flame cupped in tired hands. The Allies were preparing to squeeze the last breath out of a regime that had built its empire on lies, fear, and the bones of millions. Every soldier pushing toward Germany could sense it. You can read it in their letters. They talked about strange things, the smell of wet earth, the taste of the rations, the way the snow melted on the roadside, as if they were suddenly awake after years of moving through fog. And maybe they were. Victory had a scent, even when it hadn't arrived yet. But let me tell you, those final 100 days were no march across open fields. They were a heavy grind through ruined cities, shattered forests, and roads clogged with refugees who barely remembered their own names. The German army, broken as it was, fought like a cornered animal. And when an animal is cornered, it can still bite hard. The Allies knew it, and the Germans knew it too. Some fought out of loyalty, some out of fear, and some simply because they didn't know what else to do. Whole divisions were shadows of their former selves, made of boys who should have been in school and old men who could barely lift their rifles. The Volkssturm, they called them the People's Militia, but really it was desperation dressed in a uniform. What always strikes me most about this chapter of the war is how fast everything collapsed once the cracks started spreading. It wasn't a slow crumble, it was this sudden, unstoppable break. Hitler barked orders that had no connection to reality. Whole armies existed only on paper. City after city went silent except for the thud of artillery and the sound of their own government shouting at them over radio broadcasts that insisted Germany was moments away from a miracle. You read those transcripts now and they almost feel like ramblings from another planet. It's eerie. And yet, inside Germany, ordinary people were trying to survive inside what must have felt like a house collapsing room by room. Children were told to dig trenches. Families burned their last pieces of furniture for heat. Soldiers limped along roads littered with wrecked tanks and horse carts because fuel was a luxury no one saw anymore. By March, even the SS, the group that once walked with such arrogance, looked like ghosts. They weren't invincible figures anymore. They were simply human, tired, injured, and running out of everything. Still, with all that chaos, something remarkable happened on the Western Front. The Allies moved with a precision that almost looked rehearsed, like they'd been preparing for this exact moment for years. In a way they had. Eisenhower's headquarters became the calm eye of a hurricane. Staff officers studied maps that were practically bleeding red arrows as units shifted, advanced, and cut through whatever resistance remained. Sometimes I imagine them gathered around those huge tables late at night, rubbing their temples, drinking cold coffee, and thinking about the boys out there in the mud who were doing the real work. Everything depended on keeping the momentum going. The faster they moved, the fewer lives would be lost. And then came one of those moments in history that feels impossibly cinematic, yet it truly happened. The crossing of the Rhine, Germany's mighty river, the natural barrier they believed would protect the heart of their country. Hitler had sworn that no enemy soldier would cross it alive. But by March 1945, the Rhine might as well have been a puddle. American engineers threw bridges across it in record time, with shells hitting the water around them and snipers firing from the opposite bank. I've read engineers' memoirs where they talk about hammering steel beams while shaking from exhaustion, praying the planks wouldn't crack beneath the weight of tanks already lining up. Some didn't even look up when artillery landed nearby. They just kept working. That's what duty looked like in those 100 days. But the moment that changed everything was the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge. At Remagen, the Germans were supposed to blow it up. They tried, but the explosives were old, damp, worn out, and instead of erupting into a fireball, the bridge simply shook, cracked, and stayed standing. American soldiers stared at it in disbelief. One lieutenant said it felt like the bridge was saying, "Come on, get across before I change my mind." And they did. They crossed in waves, infantry, tanks, supply trucks, all under fire. Even after the bridge began to sag and groan, it held long enough to open the gateway into the heart of Germany. Hitler was furious beyond belief. He ordered the officers responsible to be executed, convinced they had sabotaged it. But in truth, time had simply worn the Reich down to rust. Now, before we go deeper into those last brutal weeks, let me take a quick breath with you. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, take a second to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and maybe share this video with a friend who enjoys real history told the old-fashioned way. It helps a lot and it keeps this channel going. Alright, back to those last days. Once the Rhine was behind them, the Allies didn't slow down. It was like watching a dam burst. Patton's Third Army raced across the German countryside so quickly that even the high command struggled to keep the maps updated. Patton himself complained that he could have gone even faster if they'd just given him more fuel, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. His armored columns moved with a kind of hungry energy, smashing through what remained of German defenses and capturing entire towns before the Germans even realized the front had shifted. But speed didn't mean the fighting was easy. Germany was a wounded giant stumbling backward, but it still had teeth. Some towns refused to surrender, some commanders insisted on holding their ground until the last man. And inside those towns, civilians hid in basements, praying their homes wouldn't be shelled or burned or crushed beneath collapsing roofs. That's the cruel math of war. Even when victory is certain, the cost doesn't fall to zero. There's a small diary entry I still think about sometimes. It was written by a young German girl living near Kassel. She wrote about hearing the rumble of tanks in the distance and knowing the world she grew up in was ending. She wasn't political, she wasn't part of anything, just a kid who wanted the noise to stop. Her final line reads, "Mama says we'll have peace soon, I hope peace is quiet." I don't know what happened to her, but that line has stayed with me. It captures what millions felt in those last 100 days, exhaustion more than fear. And while the Allies pushed from the west, another unstoppable force was closing in from the east. The Red Army. If the Allies were the rainstorm, the Soviets were the thunder. They advanced with sheer weight and fury built up from years of unimaginable suffering. Entire Soviet armies rolled across the Eastern Front like an iron tide. They smashed through East Prussia, swept into Silesia, and tore through the last German defenses like they were made of paper. Stalin's commanders had one goal burned into their minds: Berlin, the heart of the beast. German intelligence reports from those days read like the notes of a man trying to hold back an ocean with a broom. Units were encircled and destroyed overnight. Towns that had held out for weeks fell in hours. Refugee columns stretched for miles. People were running from a storm they couldn't outrun. And deep in his bunker, Hitler kept insisting that Germany still had secret divisions, miracle weapons, phantom armies. None of it existed. The generals knew it. The soldiers knew it. Even his own staff whispered that the end was only weeks away. And still, the killing didn't stop. Let's go a little further. The story isn't done yet. The next steps, the fall of Berlin, the final collapse, the absolute last breaths of the Third Reich, all of that is coming. Whenever you're ready for part 3, just say the word, and I'll take you right into the bunker, into the streets of Berlin, and into the moment the world finally exhaled after 6 years of madness. And so we move into those last trembling weeks of the war, when the world seemed to hold its breath even as the guns thundered louder than ever. By April 1945, Germany was no longer a country in any real sense. It was a landscape of broken roads, crowded cellars, and soldiers with hollow eyes who didn't know whether to keep fighting or simply sit down in the mud and let the world roll over them. The Allies tightened their grip from the west while the Soviets drove in from the east, and between them lay a people who had run out of time, out of hope, and out of choices. If you want to understand how surreal those final days were, picture this: German officers studying maps that were weeks old because they had no updated intelligence. Commanders calling divisions that no longer existed. Hitler shouting orders to It's that were either destroyed or surrounded or made up of kids who barely knew how to load their rifles. The Reich wasn't collapsing in an orderly way. It was falling inward like a dying star, crushing everything in its center. And at the very heart of that dark gravity well sat Berlin. A city once proud and busy, now reduced to rubble-lined streets, burned-out vehicles, and buildings that looked like giant cracked teeth. Civilians moved like shadows along the walls, ducking shells that landed without pattern or mercy. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night until the pavement shook like a drum. There are accounts from survivors describing how dust fell from the ceilings non-stop, coating their hair, their clothes, their food. One woman wrote in her diary that she'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. Another said the air tasted like brick. Meanwhile, deep underground, Hitler retreated into the Führerbunker, a concrete maze that smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and nerves stretched too thin. Officers shuffled past one another in cramped hallways, knowing their leader had detached from reality. Visitors described Hitler's hands trembling, his posture bent, his voice sometimes drifting into whispers. Still, he ranted about imaginary counterattacks, miracle armies, and betrayals. The top command knew there was no future left. They were living in the last chapter of a book whose ending had already been written. Outside, the Soviets were closing in fast. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konov drove their armies toward the city with a determination that bordered on grim justice. The Red Army had seen what the Germans did on the Eastern Front: the burned villages, the mass graves, the starvation, the cruelty without bottom. Some Soviet units fought with a rage so deep it almost frightened their own officers. And in those final days, the fighting became house to house, room to room, floor to floor. Berlin's defenders tried everything: barricades of overturned furniture, tanks hidden behind rubble, snipers perched in church towers. But nothing could stop the tide. It was too late. I once read a memoir by a Red Army soldier who said the battle for Berlin felt like running through a burning forest where every tree is shooting at you. Another wrote that he could hear people praying inside the ruins as he passed by, but he never knew who they were: soldiers, civilians, or both. War blurs those lines. In those final 100 days, everything was blurred. By April 30th, Soviet troops were only streets away from the Reich Chancellery. The bunker shook constantly from shell bursts, and that's when Hitler made the decision he'd been circling for days. He withdrew to his private room with Eva Braun, his longtime companion, and ended his life. The staff heard the muffled shot. They knew instantly what it meant. Outside, shells kept landing, and the Red Army kept advancing, unaware that the man who had plunged Europe into madness had left the world in a small, airless room underground. After Hitler's death, chaos became the new command structure. Some officers wanted to fight on, some wanted to flee, some wanted to surrender before the Soviets reached them. The Nazi government tried to relocate and pretend leadership still existed, but the truth was obvious. The Third Reich was already a corpse, and the only question left was when it would be buried. Just days later, Berlin fell. The surviving German generals in the city surrendered to the Soviets. The red flag rose over the Reichstag, not the most strategically important building, but symbolically it was the heart of the enemy. For the Soviets who'd fought from Stalingrad to Kursk to Warsaw, planting that flag felt like closing a circle of unimaginable suffering. But the war didn't end instantly with Berlin's fall. There were still millions of German troops scattered across Europe. Some surrendered willingly, relieved it was finally over. Others held out a little longer out of confusion or fear. A few fanatics fought until the last bullet, but piece by piece, front by front, Germany collapsed. And on May 7, 1945, at a schoolhouse in Reims, France, the unconditional surrender of all German forces was signed. The war in Europe, at long last, was over. You know, sometimes I pause here and think about how strange that must have felt. One day you're crawling through mud under machine gun fire, and the next day your commander says the war is finished. It feels too big to understand in a single moment. Many soldiers wrote that the silence on the front lines felt heavier than the gunfire ever did. Some cried, some laughed, some just stared into space, unable to believe that they'd survived when so many hadn't. Before we head into the final stretch of these last 100 days, let me slip in a quick reminder. If you've been drawn into the story and you want more long, human, deeply told history like this, tap that subscribe button, throw in a like, and share the video with someone who loves this era. It keeps this whole thing alive. All right, back to the final chapter. What followed Germany's surrender wasn't a clean, tidy ending. Peace never arrives the way people imagine. Europe was scarred far beyond what maps could show. Cities were gone, families were gone, entire cultures needed time to stand up again. Soldiers who'd spent years learning how to survive now had to learn how to live. And in those months after the war, the world slowly tried to steady itself. Allied soldiers walked through concentration camps and saw things their minds could hardly process. The civilians searched for loved ones. Whole countries tried to rebuild from ash. But within that bleakness, something else quietly began to grow, a strange, powerful gratitude for survival, for breath, for the chance to build something better than the ruins around them. The war had taken so much, but it hadn't taken the world's ability to hope. And when I think about those final 100 days, the speed, the fear, the chaos, the heartbreak, I'm reminded that every ending carries its own kind of weight, even when the ending is victory. There's one last thought I want to leave you with, something that ties all these moments together if you look closely enough. Even in the darkest hours, you see people doing things that don't fit into any official military record, small acts of bravery, mercy, defiance, humanity. An American medic sharing his last bandage with a German soldier. A Soviet tanker carrying a child out of a burning building. A German nurse refusing to abandon her patients even when the shells were falling closer. These tiny lights flickered everywhere in those 100 days. It reminds me, oddly enough, of the dam busters. And I know that sounds strange, jumping from Berlin's ruins to those airmen flying in the moonlight years earlier, but there's a thread that connects them. The dam busters' raid wasn't just about engineering or bravery. It was about the stubborn, almost unreasonable human refusal to let darkness have the final word. They flew into danger because they believed their actions could shorten the war, could save lives down the line, could show that courage still mattered. And that's what you feel in those last 100 days too. Beneath all the destruction, beneath the uniforms and flags and orders, you find ordinary people refusing to surrender their humanity. Even when the world was at its worst, something inside us insisted on reaching for the light. And that's where the story ends, not with the fall of Berlin, not with a signature on a surrender document, but with that quiet truth beating beneath everything else.